The marriage certificate still rests in the Louisiana State Archives, fragile and fading with time, its parchment yellowed like old bone, its ink still bearing the name of Jeremiah Aldrich beside the single word Celeste, not as wife, not as equal, but as property under his signature. What makes this artifact monstrous is not only the grotesque image of a slave owner marrying his own enslaved cook, but the trail of 13 sudden, unexplained deaths that erupted in the months following their ceremony in March of 1854. Whispers preserved in brittle Louisiana newspapers, now hidden in private collections, hint at a conspiracy so elaborate and cruel that the state's most powerful families forced the truth into silence, burying investigations under layers of wealth and privilege. What lies beneath this unholy marriage is a story of betrayal, vengeance, and ritualized torment so horrifying that even the violence-hardened soil of the antebellum South recoiled at its telling. But before we descend into the nightmare that consumed Jeremiah Aldrich at Willowbrook Plantation, pause for a moment, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from, because what you're about to hear is a history America itself tried to erase. To understand how this nightmare began, we must travel back 15 years into the mosquito-choked swamps and shadowed waters of the Mississippi Delta, where empires were built from human flesh and fortunes flowed in blood as freely as the river's muddy current. Jeremiah Aldrich did not spring from the gilded ranks of Louisiana's planter aristocracy. He was the unwanted son of a ruined Kentucky tobacco farmer, a restless young man who arrived in New Orleans in 1839 with nothing but raw ambition burning in his chest and the iron will to seize what more delicate gentlemen would not sully their gloves to touch: the slave trade. Though legal, carried a social stench among the old Creole dynasties who cloaked their fortunes in sugar and cotton, pretending innocence while their fields thrived on bondage. In the stifling heat of 1840, Aldrich struck his first bargain with Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle, two desperate men with sins and needs as deep as his own hunger for power. Devo, the disgraced youngest son of a sugar dynasty, clawed for enough coin to rescue his father's collapsing estate. Rochelle, a former ship captain broken by yellow fever and reckless speculation, carried a far darker asset: maps, names, and knowledge of the shadowed slave routes that still carried human cargo from Cuba and the Caribbean, despite the official ban. Together they baptized their new venture the Delta Trading Company. From a warehouse on New Orleans' grimy edge, in a place where the law's reach grew short and no one asked questions about the bodies arriving in chains, their business flowered in the dark. While respectable traders trafficked in papers, certificates, and titles of ownership, Aldrich's men trafficked in flesh stripped of every pretense of legality. They hunted down fugitives from failed plantations, purchased kidnapped free blacks from bounty hunters who prowled the South like wolves, and most lucratively, smuggled Africans fresh off ghost ships that still bled across the Atlantic. The profits were staggering because the men spent nothing on care, shelter, or dignity for their merchandise. For 3 years, the shadows made them rich. They funneled their blood money into businesses with smiling facades, washing themselves into respectability. Devo not only rescued, but expanded his family's plantation, transforming it into one of St. Charles Parish's glittering sugar empires. Rochelle built a fleet of riverboats and reinvented himself as a shipping magnate, and Aldrich, climbing faster than bows, purchased Willowbrook Plantation, a sprawling cotton estate crowned with a colonial mansion meant to announce his arrival into the very class that once scorned him. Yet success has a way of sharpening enemies. Wealth bred arrogance, arrogance bred mistakes, and mistakes drew eyes that mattered. By the spring of 1843, rumors slithered through New Orleans that federal marshals had begun watching the Gulf Coast for the ghosts of ships that were never meant to exist. Someone, it seemed, had begun to talk. Questions had begun to circle like vultures. Federal marshals weren't just sniffing around shipping records and false manifests. They were speaking with survivors, with flesh and blood witnesses who had slipped through the cracks of bondage and clawed their way to freedom. For the first time, the ghosts of their merchandise were speaking against them. In the summer of 1843, panic dragged the three men into an emergency meeting inside Aldrich's new study at Willowbrook. The room reeked of false grandeur. Shelves lined with leather-bound books Aldrich could barely sound out. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors who had never borne his blood. Beneath the oil lamps, the air thickened with fear as each man realized the walls of their empire were crumbling. Devo, the most anxious of the trio, was the first to break, his voice trembling as he urged immediate dissolution of the partnership and destruction of every ledger, every receipt that tied them to the trade. Rochelle, hardened by years at sea and tempered by a sailor's practicality, countered with restraint. He advocated shifting their treasure offshore, hiding the fortune in Havana until the storm of inquiry blew over. But Aldrich, ever the most ruthless, sat silently until his moment, and then unveiled a solution so cold it burned. He would erase the problem entirely. Devo and Rochelle were not partners, he told himself, but liabilities, each with knowledge capable of hanging him by the neck. His answer was murder, neat, theatrical murder, disguised as a quarrel over money. The story was already written in his mind. Two greedy men turn on one another, their fight leaving him the lone survivor of a tragic misunderstanding, conveniently left in possession of all their wealth. The stage was set for June of 1843, a night heavy with swamp heat. Aldrich summoned them to their warehouse, the same decaying structure that had sheltered their trade in flesh for 3 bloody years. He chose it precisely because it was nearly abandoned after dusk, its fate already sealed for demolition as the port expanded. He arrived first, as planned, with a pistol tucked beneath his coat and a razor-edged skinning knife pressed against his boot. His scheme was vicious in its simplicity. 1 bullet to Devo's chest, then a staged struggle with Rochelle ending in steel and blood. To strengthen the illusion, he had even purchased testimony, paying 3 dockside drunks to swear they'd overheard Devo and Rochelle quarreling violently that very day over missing funds. When his partners finally arrived, they found him waiting like a gracious host at their old table. A bottle of whiskey gleamed in the lamplight, 3 glasses catching reflections beside stacked ledgers and maps of their shadow empire. At first, the meeting played its part. Devo nervously rehearsed the legal threats they faced. Rochelle outlined schemes to spirit their accounts beyond American jurisdiction. Yet beneath the rhythm of talk and clink of glass, Aldrich's trap began to tighten. He pressed them for numbers, locations, keys, too eagerly, too often. Rochelle's sailor's instincts bristled. He caught the evasions in Aldrich's eyes, the twitch of his hand drifting again and again toward his coat, the strain in his voice whenever he steered them back to the subject of hidden cash. Unease spread across the table like a storm wind. Rochelle, wary now, suggested they break for the night, return tomorrow with lawyers' assent. In that moment, Aldrich knew the window was closing. The mask fell away. He moved with ruthless precision, drawing his pistol in one swift motion and firing point-blank into Devo's chest before the younger man could even cry out. The gunshot cracked through the cavernous warehouse like a cannon blast, its echo rolling across the empty rafters as Marcus Devo's body snapped backward in his chair. His starched white shirt blossomed with red, his eyes frozen wide with the disbelief of a man betrayed in the very moment he realized it. But Samuel Rochelle was not so easily dispatched. The grizzled sailor, hardened by storms and battles long before Aldrich ever dreamed of power, reacted with feral speed. He heaved the heavy oak table between them onto its side, sending ledgers and glass scattering, then lunged with the jagged neck of a shattered whiskey bottle, slashing across Aldrich's face. The bottle carved a deep groove into his left cheek, tearing skin to bone, a wound that would never fully heal, a scar that would mark him forever as a man touched by violence. What followed was no swift execution but a savage brawl that stretched on for nearly 10 endless minutes. Rochelle fought like a cornered wolf, each movement fueled by the clarity of knowing exactly what Aldrich intended. He would not die meekly. The 2 men tore through crates of documents, shattering boxes and scattering papers like snow across the blood-slick floor. Ledgers that could have damned them fluttered beneath their boots as they grappled, their hands locked around the glinting knife Aldrich had drawn from his boot. Every surface bore the evidence of their struggle. Smeared handprints, streaks of blood, the raw chaos of 2 men locked in mortal combat. But time, like the tide Rochelle once commanded, turned against him. At 53, his strength waned faster than Aldrich's ruthless youth. Gasping, trembling, his blows slowed until Aldrich finally seized control. With a BR, Utal Serge, he drove the blade deep into Rochelle's stomach, forcing the steel upward toward the heart. The sailor's hands clawed at Aldrich's throat even as life drained from him, his face twisted in rage and defiance. And then came the words, ragged, gasped, unforgettable. "My son knows everything. He'll come for you. When he's old enough, he'll make you pay." To Aldrich, they seemed nothing but the delirium of a dying man. He could not know that Marcus Devo's younger brother, Fipe, had begun keeping a secret record of every illegal voyage, every transaction they had buried in silence. Nor could he know that Rochelle's own 17-year-old son, Henri, possessed precise knowledge of contacts, routes and crimes, carried in memory like a curse waiting for the right moment. When Rochelle's body finally fell still, Aldrich set about his next performance. For 4 meticulous hours, he reshaped the carnage into a scene of convenience. He slumped Devo's corpse in a posture that suggested the young man had been gunned down mid-reach for a weapon. Rochelle's body he placed nearby, one bloodied hand curled around the knife, wounds carved into his arms and chest to imply the frenzy of a desperate fight. He scattered coins and torn banknotes across the floor, as if greed itself had ignited the violence. The office safe he cracked and damaged, staging a robbery gone awry. He even carved fresh cuts into his own flesh, scratches on his arms, slashes across his palms, proof, he would later claim, of a man who had barely escaped the fury of his partners. The stage was set, and the actors played their parts. Dockside laborers, bought with coin, swore they had heard Rochelle and Devo quarreling violently earlier that day over missing funds. Another witness, a corrupt worker from the wharf, testified he had heard shouts, then shots, then the crash of struggle echoing from the warehouse. At the hour of death. Most damning of all, Aldrich presented himself as the reluctant peacemaker, the survivor who had come only to calm tempers, only to find himself dragged into the storm. The police, overwhelmed with bloodier crimes across New Orleans and eager to close a case involving 3 seemingly reputable businessmen, accepted his tale with hardly a glance beneath the surface. The official record was written, Devo and Rochelle had destroyed each other in a dispute over money. Aldrich, bloodied but alive, had escaped by the narrowest of margins. Within a single week, the warehouse was razed to the ground, the city's new port swallowing its ruins and burying forever the ledgers and evidence soaked in blood. With the debris carted away, Aldrich emerged not as a suspect, but as the sole heir of their empire. He moved swiftly, presenting forged contracts that claimed Devo and Rochelle had signed their holdings over to him in the event of their deaths. Banks that had once eyed 3 obscure traders with suspicion now bent easily before a man who wore the mask of a plantation gentleman. Cotton fields on paper gave him the legitimacy blood money never could, and so the fortune of the Delta Trading Company passed seamlessly into his hands. In the months that followed the bloodbath at the warehouse, Jeremiah Aldrich moved like a vulture circling carrion, stripping every account, every safe deposit box, every stash of hidden cash that had once belonged to his slain partners. By his own tally, the fortune he seized neared $40,000, a staggering sum equal to over $1 million in today's reckoning. But the money was not the only prize. With Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle silenced forever, Aldrich had eliminated the only men who could tie him to the Delta Trading Company's shadow empire. He believed himself free to shed the filth of his past and emerge reborn as a respectable figure in Louisiana's planter aristocracy. Yet in his ruthless haste, Aldrich overlooked the most dangerous variable of all, blood ties. He had not considered that the families of the men he had murdered would see through the lies, nor that their surviving heirs would dedicate their lives to his ruin. He had not imagined that the seeds of vengeance once planted could grow patiently for years, watered by grief, tended by rage, until they bore a harvest so devastating that death itself would pale beside it. Marcus's younger brother, Philippe Devo, was 22 when word arrived that his elder sibling had been killed. Unlike the reckless Devo men who had squandered fortunes on quick indulgences, Philippe was cut from colder steel. He possessed a calculating intelligence, patient and meticulous, the kind of mind that makes vengeance more terrifying than violence. As Marcus's confidant and unofficial steward, Philippe had maintained precise records of their dealings, keeping coded ledgers of the Delta Trading Company's darkest transactions. Illegal slave purchases, contraband shipping manifests from forbidden Caribbean routes, and, most damning, letters proving collusion with corrupt officials. Philippe had always distrusted Jeremiah Aldrich. From the first, something in the Kentuckian's eagerness to plunge into the most brutal corners of the trade had struck him as more than greed. It reeked of hunger, of a cruelty too deliberate to be chance. Months before the murders, Philippe had already begun prying into Aldrich's past, uncovering inconsistencies in his origin story and financial anomalies that hinted at hidden motives. So when news came that Marcus had died in a supposed quarrel with Rochelle, Philippe's first emotion was not grief. It was rage. Sharp, cold, calculating rage. The official story smelled of rot to anyone who truly knew the three men. Marcus was desperate, yes, but cautious by nature. He would never raise his hand in violence against a partner. Rochelle, hardened though he was by the sea, handled disputes through ledger and negotiation, not drunken knife fights. As and most damning of all, Aldrich's version of events contained details Philippe knew to be lies, mentions of funds and account locations that had already been moved weeks earlier. Within days of Marcus's burial, Philippe quietly began his own inquiry. Using his brother's old contacts, he questioned dock workers, cross-examined shipping clerks, and bribed police officers to glimpse the official files. The truth that emerged was unmistakable. The crime scene had been staged. The witnesses had been purchased. Evidence that could have unmasked Aldrich had been deliberately buried or destroyed. And worse, Philippe learned that Aldrich had begun seizing his partner's assets within hours of their deaths, proof not of shock or survival, but of cold, calculated preparation. Meanwhile, across New Orleans, Henri Rochelle, Samuel's only son, was pursuing his own investigation, coming at the mystery from another direction entirely. At 24, Henri carried not only his father's seafaring network, but also a formal education in law and commerce, a combination that made him uniquely suited to follow the paper trail of money and power. He had spent years in the counting houses and banks of New Orleans, cultivating friendships with clerks, brokers, and managers who whispered information others never heard. Where Philippe's inquiry was fueled by fury and directness, Henri's was methodical, professional, guided by ledger entries and contract clauses, and what he uncovered would strip away any illusion that Aldrich's crime had been one of impulse. Piece by piece, Henri exposed the scale of the theft, the fraud, and the monstrous deception that had allowed Jeremiah Aldrich to rise on the corpses of his partners. By meticulously dissecting banking ledgers, maritime shipping manifests, and the labyrinth of property transfers, Henri pieced together a damning portrait of Aldrich's crimes. Evidence revealed how the murderer had coldly and systematically plundered every trace of wealth once belonging to the Delta Trading Company. His thefts amounted to more than $60,000 in cash, property, and investments, wealth equal to years of blood-soaked profits carved from the agony of enslaved men, women, and children. Yet what made Henri Rochelle a far more formidable adversary was not the numbers he uncovered, but his piercing grasp of Louisiana's tangled financial and legal machinery. Unlike Philippe, whose relentless pursuit was rooted in the exposure of guilt through testimony and evidence, Henri saw the greater weapon lay in patience and strategy. He understood that Aldrich's own vices could be turned against him, that the surest path to vengeance was not a corrupt courtroom, but the slow suffocation of his financial empire. The two heirs met for the first time in the autumn of 1844, more than a year after their families had been shattered. Their clandestine meeting unfolded within a discreet French Quarter restaurant, where Philippe spread out his coded ledgers and forged alliances in ink and whispers. Neither young man had anticipated the uncanny harmony of their separate skills, nor how quickly the hunger for justice would fuse into obsession. By the spring of 1845, what began as parallel investigations had evolved into a calculated conspiracy, an intricate web designed to entrap Jeremiah Aldrich with the very methods he had perfected: betrayal, fraud, financial ruin, and, at the final stroke, violence disguised beneath the mask of commerce. But unlike Aldrich's reckless brutality, their scheme would be precise, disciplined, and devastatingly complete. The opening phase demanded infiltration. Philippe Deveau, leveraging the remnants of his family's social standing, drifted effortlessly into the very circles Aldrich sought to conquer. Gentlemen's tea, clubs, political salons, and lavish society gatherings became his stage. He did not challenge Aldrich directly. Instead, he studied. He mapped his rivals' routines, catalogued his habits, and noted each weakness with the diligence of a surgeon preparing for a long, merciless operation. Philippe's charm, so like his late brother's, made him the perfect confidant, an amiable companion for drinks and idle chatter, never threatening enough to arouse suspicion. Meanwhile, Henri worked from the shadows of the banking world. Using his connections among New Orleans clerks and financiers, he traced the delicate scaffolding of Aldrich's supposed fortune. What emerged was a house of cards, plantations leveraged against risky ventures, loans stacked upon fragile credit, dazzling short-term gains hiding crushing long-term debts. And beneath it all, Henry uncovered the true cancer, Aldrich's growing addiction to gambling. He squandered thousands at poker tables and racetracks, his losses financed by reckless borrowing against future harvests. This vice, Henry knew, was the chink in the armor. By 1848, Henry had quietly secured employment at the First National Bank of New Orleans, the very institution holding the mortgage to Willowbrook Plantation. From this vantage, he became Aldrich's invisible executioner. He manipulated the smallest of details: interest rates raised by fractions, payment schedules timed to squeeze liquidity during planting seasons, renewal terms crafted to strangle rather than sustain. Each adjustment seemed harmless in isolation, but together they drove Aldrich into an ever-deepening pit of debt and desperation. Simultaneously, Philippe worked another flank. He forged alliances with New Orleans' most infamous gambling barons, men who presided over velvet-draped parlors where fortunes evaporated in an evening's play. With quiet precision, he ensured Aldrich's name appeared on the guest lists for the highest stakes tables, where temptation and ruin waited side by side. There, surrounded by false camaraderie and the lure of easy gain, Aldrich was nudged ever closer to the abyss his enemies had prepared. Through carefully placed bribes and whispered promises of future favors, Philippe secured Aldrich's seat at gaming tables designed to ruin him. These were no ordinary contests of chance, but orchestrated traps, where every shuffle of the deck and every roll of the dice had been fixed to bleed him dry. The beauty of their campaign lay not in speed, but in its patience, its relentless subtlety. They refused to strike him with blades or bullets. Instead, they set about dismantling the very foundation on which his fortune, his reputation, and his fragile pride had been built. Each loan that matured pressed tighter on his chest. Each gambling defeat carved deeper into his desperation. Each reckless attempt to snatch quick profit through dangerous schemes dragged him closer to the precipice of collapse. By 1851, the noose they had woven around him began to bite. Aldrich's debts soared to nearly $30,000, and the interest alone devoured the bulk of Willowbrook's yearly harvest. Forced to auction off fertile tracts of his estate to cover his mounting losses, he became the subject of quiet whispers among Louisiana's planter elite. Rumors spread like fire that the once-admired plantation was crumbling into ruin, but the greater collapse was internal. His character, once coldly composed, began to fracture under the weight of unending strain. He grew short-tempered, paranoid of every neighbor's glance, and frantic in his pursuit of fresh income. Yet for Philippe and Henri, this was not nearly enough. They sought not only to bankrupt him, but to drag him through the same pit of fear and degradation their murdered kin had endured. Aldrich had to taste humiliation. He had to know in his bones that his prospectus was built on blood, and that justice, unyielding and patient, had finally arrived for him. To complete their vengeance, they needed him so cornered that death itself would seem a mercy. But he had to live long enough to recognize the elegance of their cruelty. It was Henry who first voiced the unthinkable. Aldrich would be destroyed through his own enslaved people. Every planter harbored nightmares of rebellion, of shadows rising with blades in the dark. That terror could be twisted, exploited, turned into a weapon sharper than steel. Yet Henry argued against a real revolt. It would be dangerous, uncontrollable, and morally fraught. Instead, he proposed a degradation so public, so irreversible, that Aldrich's name would rot in the eyes of his peers. He would be forced into marriage with one of those he claimed to own. From that moment, his respectability would wither, leaving him socially damned and legally shackled. The choice of Celeste was no accident. Philippe and Henri spent months watching every soul laboring at Willowbrook, weighing who might inflict the most catastrophic blow. Celeste emerged as the perfect instrument, not merely for her presence but for her mind and her fury. At 38 she carried a formidable frame, yet her true power lay deeper. She possessed a fierce intelligence, a survivor's instinct sharpened by years of cruelty, and, most vital of all, an unbroken hatred for Jeremiah Aldrich. Where others masked their feelings for survival, Celeste let hers burn unhidden, a fire Philippe and Henri intended to unleash with devastating precision. Unlike so many enslaved people who perfected the art of disguising their emotions behind forced smiles and hollow words of submission, Celeste had never wasted the energy to mask her rage. Her disdain for the man who claimed ownership of her life was open, unflinching, and carved deep into every glance she cast in his direction. She executed her duties as Willowbrook's head cook with absolute compose. Tense, producing meals that rivaled the tables of New Orleans' finest houses, yet those who paid attention could not miss the icy hatred that lingered in her gaze each time Aldrich entered the kitchen. That hatred was no passing mood, but the scar tissue of wounds that had never healed. She had been ripped from her husband and 3 children in 1847, when Aldrich purchased her from a collapsing Mississippi estate. The transaction had not been dictated by necessity. Aldrich could have afforded to purchase her entire family. Instead, with the casual cruelty of a man who valued nothing but utility, he selected only Celeste, sneering that he had no interest in, as he put it, extra mouths to feed. When she pleaded desperately for him to take her youngest, a 10-year-old daughter, Aldrich mocked her grief with laughter, declaring that his plantation was a business, not a sanctuary for the offspring of slaves. For 7 relentless years, Celeste endured the agony of preparing banquets for the man who had shattered her world, laying dishes of fine meat and wine before him while she and the kitchen staff survived on scraps and spoiled leftovers. She listened as he boasted of triumphs in commerce, knowing every boast was built upon graves, stolen wealth, and the betrayal of men once called partners. She laundered his blood-stained clothing after unexplained midnight journeys, and she watched him burn incriminating letters in her hearth, his desperation barely concealed. Every season, she stored away fragments of knowledge, his routines, his appetites, the opiates he relied on for his ailing stomach, the places in the house he haunted during sleepless nights. Piece by piece, she assembled a map of his weaknesses so precise that it made her a dangerous weapon waiting to be sharpened. Philippe and Henri recognized her potential, yet their approach demanded care. To be seen engaging with an enslaved woman on Aldrich's property would have been suicide both legally and socially, so they turned to trusted intermediaries, free people of color with legitimate business in New Orleans markets who could, without suspicion, carry messages and coin to rural plantations. Through these quiet channels, they reached Celeste, at first only requesting simple intelligence, notes of his movements, hints about his finances, scraps of gossip from within Willowbrook's walls. The information she sent back astonished them. Celeste was no passive observer. She had already been conducting a silent war of attrition against her oppressor. She salted his food deliberately, aggravating his fragile stomach. She broke his favorite china and keepsakes with feigned clumsiness. She seeded rumors among the enslaved quarters about his mounting debts and whispered that he was plotting to sell them south to pay his creditors. Her sabotage was always subtle, always deniable, but relentless, designed to eat away at Aldrich's sanity until he no longer trusted even the walls of his own home. When, at last, Philippe and Henri unveiled their identities and the vast design they had forged to ruin Jeremiah Aldrich, Celeste did not hesitate. Her answer came with the force of a lifetime's fury. She would help. She would destroy him. She would lend every ounce of her knowledge and cunning to their cause. But she named one condition, firm and unbending, that her service be rewarded with manumission and safe passage north to Canada, where whispers told of free soil and the faint hope of finding the children torn from her arms. The two young avengers agreed without pause, for they understood that in Celeste they had secured not merely a conspirator, but an ally whose thirst for justice burned with the same consuming fire as their own. It was with her addition that the final contours of their revenge began to sharpen, each detail honed like the edge of a blade. For months, the conspiracy unfolded. With deliberate precision, each move calculated like strokes on a chessboard where Aldrich himself was the unsuspecting king being maneuvered into checkmate. Through a seamless combination of engineered gambling losses, predatory loans, and carefully timed calls from creditors, his fortune was methodically dismantled until the last fragile supports of his empire gave way. When the collapse reached its inevitable conclusion, he would be presented with an ultimatum more humiliating than death itself: marry Celeste in a binding legal ceremony, or face the swift retribution of creditors who had already circled like vultures. Such a marriage would annihilate his standing in Louisiana's planter aristocracy, transfer practical control of his estate into the hands of Philippe and Henri through Celeste, and most crucial of all, grant her the intimate access required to slowly poison Aldrich, condemning him to the same drawn-out agony endured by those whose lives his ambition had stolen. Yet all of this depended on timing. The trap required a moment when his desperation was absolute, when he was too isolated to call upon friends in law enforcement or sympathetic politicians. That moment arrived in February 1854. Henry learned that Aldrich, in a final act of reckless bravado, intended to gamble for his survival at a high-stakes poker tournament in New Orleans. The venue was a shadowed warehouse near the waterfront, a place where gamblers, criminals, and the city's most desperate men gathered to wager their futures on cards and dice. That night, the Mississippi breathed a heavy fog that crept through the cobbled streets, swallowing sound and reducing the gas lamps to smears of dull orange light. The atmosphere carried the weight of nightmare, blurring the line between reality and doom. Into this haze stepped Jeremiah Aldrich, clutching a worn leather satchel that contained everything left of his liquidity, $8,000 scraped together from the sale of slaves, plantation equipment, and heirlooms once displayed with pride at Willowbrook. It was his final bid to stave off foreclosure, his last grasp at dignity. What he could not see was that Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle had already constructed the stage upon which his downfall would play. Every player at the table had been carefully selected, bribed, or blackmailed into service. Their mission was not simply to defeat Aldrich, but to strip him clean, to ruin him so thoroughly that he would crawl willingly into the final act of the scheme. The game was 5-card stud poker, the kind of contest designed to bleed men of both coin and confidence. The opening stakes of $500 a hand were already enough to cripple lesser fortunes, and as the hours dragged forward, those numbers swelled, swollen by whiskey, sweat, and desperation. At first, Aldrich believed fortune favored him. He won modest pots, felt the thrill of recovery, and convinced himself that fate had finally bent to his will. But as the liquor dulled his caution, he wagered with increasing recklessness, emboldened by the illusion of a streak. The conspirators allowed him small triumphs, victories designed to hook him deeper, to keep him chained to the table while the pot swelled into something monstrous. By midnight, half his stake had evaporated. Yet still he played, his eyes glassy with terror and hope, knowing that this night was all that remained between him and ruin. The final hand began just after 2 a.m. Outside, the fog pressed so densely against the warehouse windows that the glow of the street lamps was smothered to pale ghosts. Inside, the table gleamed with sweat and spilled liquor as the dealer slid the cards into trembling hands. Aldrich stared down at his spread, a pair of kings revealed, with the seductive possibility of a full house resting in the hidden cards. His heart leapt. Here, at last, was salvation. He shoved his last $3,000 into the center, hands shaking but eyes fierce with the conviction that destiny was his to reclaim. But the others, bound together in silent collusion, held weapons sharper than luck. Their hands were stronger. Their wages had been synchronized to build a pot vast enough not only to empty Aldrich's satchel, but to bury him beneath obligations far beyond what he could ever repay. And when the final cards turned, the cruel truth glared back at him. His proud pair of kings crumbled into dust before superior hands, and with that revelation, Jeremiah Aldrich's fortune, reputation, and future all collapsed into ash. The final cards turned, and his kings collapsed beneath the brutal certainty of a full house held by a man Aldrich did not recognize, a pale, cold-eyed stranger who gathered the winnings with the deliberate calm of someone who had already foreseen the outcome. The truth of his ruin rolled over Jeremiah like a chill tide. He sat rigid at the empty table, staring at the green felt where his last hope had vaporized. The other players melted away into the fogged streets, leaving only the stranger across from him, who remained seated and observed Aldrich with the detached curiosity of a naturalist studying a rare specimen. After a long, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch the seconds thin, the man spoke, his voice carrying a faint French lilt that tugged at some half-remembered familiarity Aldrich could not place. "Mr. Aldrich," the stranger said, "I believe we should discuss your outstanding obligations. These gentlemen are not mere gamblers. They represent certain business interests that have been far too patient with your default." At that instant, Philippe Deveau stepped from the shadow near the warehouse door, the guttering gaslight catching his face in a way that made the resemblance to his slain brother undeniable. Ice ran through Aldrich's veins as the features he had seen contort in Marcus. As last moments returned to him, the same shock, the same betrayed stare that had accompanied a bullet 11 years before. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jeremiah," Philippe said, his approach measured, almost predatory as he closed in on the table. "Perhaps because you have. My name is Philippe Deveau, and you were quite close to my brother Marcus. In fact, you were the last man to see him alive, weren't you?" The warehouse air seemed to harden. The humid Louisiana night outside could not warm the sudden chill within. Aldrich's hands trembled as comprehension assembled itself into a single, undeniable image. This had never been a chance to rescue his estate, but a trap crafted with years of patience and a hatred honed into precision. Henri Rochelle emerged from a darker corner of the room to complete the circle around him, and the two men became an unambiguous tribunal. "My father Samuel used to say," Henri began, his tone slow and cold, "you were clever, Mr. Aldrich. Clever enough to kill two men and seize their fortunes, but evidently not clever enough to foresee that dead men sometimes leave sons who can remember and who will not forget their father's murderers." Beyond their words, the warehouse fell into a hush broken only by distant ship horns that rolled across the fog-swaddled river. Immobilized between his accusers, Aldrich's mind scrambled for escape routes and found them barred. He was trapped in an isolated building with two men who had spent more than a decade drafting his ruin, and his total financial collapse meant no one would begin to look for him if he vanished into the Delta. Philippe seated himself opposite with slow composure, eyes fixed on Aldrich as though cataloguing the last vestiges of a once proud man. "We know everything, Jeremiah," he said, the accusation simple and absolute. "We know of the Delta Trading Company and your illegal trade in human flesh. We know about the warehouse where you murdered our fathers in cold blood. We know of forged papers, paid witnesses, and how you stole the lives they built. Most of all, we know that for 11 years you have been living on blood money, raising your supposed respectability, building your plantation. Existence itself, Aldrich realized, had been built, like his plantation, on the bones of men he had betrayed and the blood of those whose voices he had silenced. Henri came in from the opposite side of the table, moving like an attorney about to deliver a closing argument, and drew from beneath his coat a weathered leather folder heavy with papers. With slow, deliberate care, he opened it and fanned the contents across the green felt as though laying out exhibits before a jury. "These," Henri said, his voice as sharp as a blade, "are certified copies of every transaction you have executed since 1843, Mr. Aldrich. Bank ledgers detailing the theft of our father's savings, property deeds charting how you converted their estates into your own, even the correspondence with crooked officials who smoothed your path, men who now value their own skins far more than they value keeping your secrets." Each sheet of paper landed like a hammer blow. The pile of evidence was vast, damning, and impossible to dispute. Aldrich's eyes moved frantically over signatures and seals he recognized, documents he had believed burned to ash years ago, financial trails that could only have been uncovered by relentless investigation and a fortune spent on bribes. Worst of all were the sworn affidavits, the testimonies of witnesses who had watched him commit his crimes and had stayed silent until the moment of reckoning arrived. Philippe and Henri had constructed not just a case that would destroy him in any court of law, but an arsenal of proof capable of dragging down dozens of Louisiana's most respected citizens who had unknowingly laundered his blood money. Philippe's voice cut the air like a whip. "The question now is not whether you are guilty. It is what we shall do with this information. We could hand it to federal prosecutors who would relish making an example of you, and of every banker, broker, and judge who helped you bury our father's wealth inside Louisiana's institutions. Or," he continued, his eyes narrowing, "we could whisper to the right ears in New Orleans that you have been living a lie for over a decade, a lie built on the slaughter of their partners and friends. Either path would end with your death, likely preceded by a level of suffering you cannot yet imagine." Aldrich at last managed to croak words from a throat gone dry. What do you want? Money? I can raise money. My plantation—" "Your plantation," Henri cut in like a knife through paper, "is worthless. We hold the mortgage. We own your debts. Every loan you've taken, every note you've signed, every gambling IOU you've clutched like a lifeline. We've bought them all. Everything that kept you afloat now belongs to us." His voice dropped to a cold whisper. "You have nothing left to bargain with but your life. And frankly, Mr. Aldrich, even that does not interest us very much." The warehouse seemed to darken, the damp air pressing against Aldrich's skin as he absorbed the enormity of his ruin. He was not simply bankrupt. He was a prisoner of men who had spent more than a decade dismantling the very world he had built, sons of the fathers he had murdered now holding him in a vice of their making, and yet even as terror clawed at his chest, some desperate corner of his mind clung to the idea that death might still be postponed. Philippe leaned forward, his tone shifting to something almost thoughtful, almost playful. "There is, however, one path left," he said softly. "One way you might continue breathing, for a time. It would demand a sacrifice of your dignity, Mr. Aldrich, but then dignity is all you have left. A public acknowledgement of your true self and a living demonstration of your absolute submission to our authority," Henri declared, his lips curling in the cold satisfaction of a man about to unveil the culmination of years of relentless planning. "You're going to marry one of your own slaves, Jeremiah, publicly, legally, permanently. You're going to stand before God, before Louisiana society, and take your cook, Celeste, as your lawful wedded wife. You're going to live as her husband, share her bed, and present yourself to your neighbors as a man who voluntarily chose to marry his own property." The suggestion was so grotesque, so far beyond the boundaries of acceptable conduct in antebellum Louisiana, that Aldrich at first could not even comprehend what he was hearing. Marriage between a white plantation master and an enslaved woman was not merely socially unacceptable. It was legal suicide, social annihilation, and a humiliation so total it would make death appear merciful by comparison. "You're insane," Aldrich whispered hoarsely. "No one would ever. It's impossible. No preacher would perform such a ceremony. No court would recognize." "Actually, we've already made the necessary arrangements," Philippe replied smoothly, his voice like a blade drawn across silk. There's a minister in Natchitoches parish who is deeply indebted to certain gambling establishments. He has agreed to conduct a completely legal ceremony, properly witnessed, properly documented. As for the courts, Louisiana law is quite clear. Once a marriage contract is executed, it is binding, no matter the circumstances. You would be legally married to Celeste, with all the rights and obligations that entails. Henri leaned forward across the poker table, his eyes glittering with a malicious satisfaction that was almost luminous in the dim light. "The beauty of this arrangement, Mr. Aldrich," he said softly, "is that it gives you a choice. You can refuse our generous offer and so to face immediate consequences for your crimes, consequences involving considerably more physical pain than you could possibly imagine, or you can accept temporary humiliation in exchange for continued life, however degraded that life may become." The warehouse fell silent again, heavy and airless, as Aldrich wrestled with an impossible decision. Death would be final, but it would preserve at least a shred of his reputation. His neighbors might remember him as a gambler and a failed planter, but they would not know the truth of his murders or his thefts. Marriage to Celeste, on the other hand, would obliterate every remaining scrap of his social identity while keeping him alive to endure years of public disgrace and private torment. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice breaking. "If I agree to this arrangement, how long would it last?" Philippe and Henri exchanged a long look, a look dense with shared understanding and mutual satisfaction. "For the rest of your natural life, Mr. Aldrich," Philippe said at last, his tone almost ceremonial. "Marriage is a sacred bond, after all," and here his voice dropped to a silken threat. "Given your age and your apparent health problems, we suspect your natural life may not last as long as you might hope." The implication hung in the dim warehouse air, clear and chilling as the tolling of a funeral bell. They were not offering him a fleeting disgrace followed by eventual release. They were offering him a slow execution hidden behind the mask of matrimony, an unbroken torture designed to break his will, hollow out his pride, and erase his soul before finally claiming his body. Yet the alternative, an immediate death in a fog-drenched warehouse and a nameless body dumped into the hungry waters of the Mississippi, seemed even darker, even more final than whatever ritualized torment they had crafted for him. Just when it felt that the nightmare had reached its peak, the horror inside this certain Louisiana warehouse deepened. If this unfolding story chills you to the bone, share it with someone who hungers for tales of shadowed mysteries. Press that like button to keep our stories alive, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next descent into darkness. Together, we will uncover what happens next. After what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes, Aldrich slowly raised his head and fixed his eyes on his tormentors. "If I agree to this marriage," he rasped, "what assurance do I have that you won't kill me anyway?" "None at all," Henri replied with pitiless candor. "But you do have our word that when death finally comes, it will be far gentler than the original fate we had designed for you. Consider the marriage an opportunity to prove your good conduct. Submission will be met with mercy. Defiance will invite invention." Philippe reached into his coat and drew forth a folded document, placing it on the table beside the mountain of evidence detailing Aldrich's crimes. "This," he said, "is a marriage contract, properly prepared, legally binding, and ready for your signature. The ceremony is scheduled for tomorrow evening at Willowbrook Plantation. All your neighbors and business associates will be invited to witness your voluntary union with Celeste. They've been told that you have undergone a religious awakening and wish to display your Christian charity by elevating one of your slaves to the dignity of wife. The final indignity lay in the performance itself. He must present the marriage as his own decision, a benevolent act of Christian virtue rather than the forced degradation it truly was. His neighbors would think him eccentric, perhaps unhinged, but they would also believe he had chosen this path willingly. No one would suspect the hidden hands of the vengeful sons of murdered partners, because no one else even remembered that Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle had ever lived. Aldrich reached for the contract with hands trembling so violently that the paper fluttered like a trapped bird between his fingers. The terms were brutally simple and absolute. He would marry Celeste in a legal ceremony, live with her as husband and wife, and provide for her upkeep as any lawful spouse. In return, his creditors would delay immediate collection of his debts and permit him to continue operating Willowbrook Plantation under their control. As he scrawled his signature on the document that would erase the life he had built, Aldrich tried to persuade himself that compliance might buy time, that perhaps some hidden escape remained, a sympathetic authority, a flight to another state, a legal loophole to dissolve the marriage. But even as these frantic thoughts flickered, he saw the hard satisfaction burning in Philippe and Henri's eyes. They had engineered this night for over a decade. They had anticipated every escape before he had even thought of it. "Welcome to the family, brother-in-law," Philippe murmured, collecting the contract with a predator's smile. "We'll see you tomorrow evening for the ceremony. I trust you'll attire yourself suitably for a day that history itself will remember." The morning of March 15th, 1854, arrived under a sky swollen with grief, grey and oppressive, the heavens veiled by heavy clouds that threatened a relentless rain, while the air was thick with humid winds, carrying the stench of rotting vegetation drifting from the nearby swamps. Aldrich had not closed his eyes since stumbling back from New Orleans, instead wandering his study like a condemned prisoner, pacing his cell, staring endlessly at the marriage contract that stood like a death sentence, the obliteration of everything he had struggled to construct over 15 long years in Louisiana. Celeste had already been told of the arrangement through carefully chosen intermediaries, though she feigned surprise when Aldrich clumsily attempted to explain matters during breakfast. She listened to his trembling account of debts, obligations, and social ruin with the patient, almost parental detachment of one humoring a child confessing minor sins. When at last his pitiful justification collapsed, she merely inclined her head and said, "Yes, Master Aldrich, I understand. I'll prepare myself for the ceremony." That calm resignation chilled him more than open rage ever could, for it betrayed not defeat, but foreknowledge, a quiet certainty that hinted she had been prepared for this role long before he had been dragged into submission. As he watched her move with quiet precision around the kitchen, preparing what would be their final meal as master and slave, Aldrich began to grasp the depth of his tormentor's design. They had thought of everything. They had left nothing to chance. By midday, neighbors and acquaintances began arriving at Willowbrook Plantation, drawn by invitations Philippe and Henri had dispatched under Aldrich's name. These guests were told they were to witness a remarkable spectacle of Christian charity, a man of standing elevating a faithful servant to the dignity of wife. Some expected an elaborate jest. Others came curious to see if Aldrich's mounting financial disasters had driven him into a final lunacy. Yet what awaited them was no joke but a fully orchestrated wedding, flowers, refreshments, solemn seating, and at its center, a trembling groom performing with the desperation of a man who knew his very survival hinged upon a flawless performance. Dressed in his finest attire as instructed by Philippe, Aldrich forced himself to smile, reciting the well-rehearsed tale of religious conversion and Christian duty with just enough cracked sincerity that most guests accepted it as eccentricity born of strain. Celeste entered for the ceremony clothed in a simple yet dignified gown provided for the occasion. At 38, her figure was formidable, yet she carried herself with a poise that unsettled even the most skeptical onlookers. More striking still, she seemed to glow under the recognition, smiling warmly, thanking the assembly for witnessing what she named the most important day of my life. The minister from Natchitoches parish performed with mechanical precision, intoning the sacred vows, prompting responses that drew uneasy glances from the crowd. When the solemn phrase came, "Speak now or forever hold your peace," several shifted uneasily, but no one dared interrupt what stood, at least on paper, as a legal and voluntary union. Aldrich's vows emerged broken, scarcely audible beyond the first row, while Celeste's replies rang steady, firm, and disturbingly assured. She pledged to love, honor, and obey her new husband with a conviction so unshaken that for an instant the whole surreal tableau seemed almost ordinary, as though Louisiana society had long accepted such unions between master and slave. But the moment of greatest horror arrived when the minister declared them husband and wife, commanding Aldrich to seal the vow with a kiss. His face blanched to a ghastly pallor, his body trembling as though his very soul were rebelling. For an instant it appeared he might collapse to the floor in humiliation and dread. Yet before the gathering, Celeste steadied him with a composure that only deepened the nightmare. Gentleness steadied him, as Celeste rose on her toes, pressing her lips to his in a fleeting, chastened kiss that bound their union before the law and marked the true beginning of his unraveling. When the guests drifted away, muttering disbelief and shaking their heads at the spectacle they had just endured, Aldrich stood stranded in the silence of Willowbrook, imprisoned now with the woman who had become his wife beneath the same roof that once proclaimed his triumph in Louisiana society. The grand house no longer felt like home. Its familiar walls seemed to lean inward with menace, every hallway transformed by the ceremony into hostile corridor, every chamber into a reminder that he was no longer master. Celeste, however, moved with ease, her steps carrying the authority of one who understood the tide had turned forever. With unshaken confidence, she began shifting chairs, removing portraits, altering the placement of his possessions as though staking her rightful claim, and in every action she announced herself as the new mistress of the estate. When Aldrich dared protest, his voice sharp with desperation, she silenced him with nothing more than a gaze honed sharp by years of hidden fury. "We are married now, Jeremiah," she said softly, her words sharpened with venom. "Husband and wife, partners. I believe it is time we start behaving accordingly. Don't you?" That first night, when he lay beside her in the bed that had once been the fortress of his solitude, Aldrich realized the true genius of the trap into which he had fallen. Death would have been clean, final, merciful. Instead, his enemies had bound him to a punishment that breathed beside him in the dark, a constant reminder of his ruin. Each dish she set before him, each carefully chosen word, each gesture that imitated tenderness, carried the weight of accusation. His comfortable existence, once gilded with wealth and status, was now being eroded by daily reminders of blood and betrayal, and yet he had not yet glimpsed the deepest horror. The marriage was no climax, it was an opening act. Philippe and Henri had orchestrated a theatre of vengeance, and the performance had only begun. The first month passed cloaked in an almost disarming calm. Celeste executed her new role with frightening skill, managing the servants with firm authority, welcoming the few guests bold enough to cross Willowbrook's threshold, and maintaining the thin veil of gentility that allowed Aldrich to cling to the ghost of respectability. To outsiders, it looked like a strange boo. To functional union, eccentric but intact, as if eccentricity alone explained their bond, but Aldrich, inside those walls, felt the subtle shift of poison in his daily rhythm. His morning coffee carried a bitterness he could not name. His evening meals, though crafted with elegance and precision, left him unsettled, his stomach aching, his limbs heavy, and most chilling of all, a fog crept through his mind. Headaches gnawed at his skull, dizziness swayed his steps, and the symptoms seemed to pulse stronger whenever Celeste was near. At first he blamed shame, the crushing strain of living as a pariah shackled to his enemy's design. Yet as days bled into weeks and his weakness deepened, another thought wormed its way into his mind. This was no accident. That suspicion turned to grim certainty when Dr. Hamilton Warren, Willowbrook's longtime physician, arrived after Aldrich collapsed mid-conversation with cotton brokers. With grave eyes and a hushed voice, the doctor explained his findings. The signs were unmistakable. Aldrich's body bore the scars of gradual poisoning, his stomach lining inflamed, his nervous system failing, his life eroding grain by grain, as if measured out by a cruel hand. "Aldrich," Dr. Warren murmured gravely as he closed his worn leather case of medical instruments, his face shadowed with the weight of grim certainty. "The pattern of your illness suggests prolonged exposure to arsenic or a comparable metallic toxin. Such poisonings unfold not in days but over many long months, with the victim descending step by step into weakness, chronic digestive afflictions, and creeping neurological collapse. Without swift intervention and removal from the source, the condition is inexorably fatal." The words shattered what little hope Aldrich still clung to, confirming his deepest, most unspoken fear, that his wife's calm obedience had been nothing but a mask for lethal intent. Celeste was dismantling him piece by piece with the same patient cruelty that Philippe and Henri had wielded against his fortune and his reputation. She was dosing him carefully, methodically, weaving poison into his daily sustenance, crafting a death so slow and seamless it would pass as natural to every outsider blind to deliberate malice. Yet confrontation, Aldrich knew, would be suicide. Celeste's armor was her legality as his wife, her veil of apparent innocence, and above all, the iron shield of the two men who ruled every thread of his survival. If he accused her, she could dismiss it with a soft laugh, while Philippe and Henri would respond with brutal swiftness, punishing him for daring to challenge their chosen executioner. So Aldrich turned instead to secrecy and desperate countermeasures. He began preparing his own meals in hidden corners, using ingredients he purchased himself and cooking utensils stashed away in his study like contraband. He refused every drink that passed through Celeste's hands, choosing only the water from a private well he alone could reach. At night, he locked himself in a guest room, no longer daring to share the marital bed where unconsciousness might invite his wife's final touch. For a time, these defenses slowed the venom's grip, granting him fragile reprieve, but they birthed new dangers of their own. Visitors to Willowbrook noted his hollowed features, his jittering mannerisms, his reluctance to swallow so much as a crumb in Celeste's presence. Whispers spread across the parish. Jeremiah Aldrich had gone mad, undone by shame, poverty, and a grotesque marriage. Celeste played her role with diabolical grace. When neighbors fretted over her husband's decline, she answered with tender sighs, the pained devotion of a wife watching her beloved drift into illness. She laid out lavish meals he would not touch, pressed glasses of wine he would not sip, her every gesture painting her as faithful caretaker to a husband unraveling before her eyes. The genius of her performance was that Aldrich's cautious refusals appeared not as survival, but delusion. His mistrust of her seemed madness. His secrecy reeked of paranoia. Even when he pleaded with Dr. Warren, even when he confided in men he thought loyal, his words were dismissed as the ravings of a broken mind crushed by ruin. No one could imagine that a woman who had been enslaved mere months earlier might conceive and execute such a meticulous design of death, or that she might command both the resources and the cunning to administer exotic toxins in doses so precise they mimicked illness. By the time spring of 1854 bled into summer, Aldrich realized he was no longer a plantation master clinging to dignity. He was a condemned man, imprisoned in his own estate, living each day beneath the shadow of a wife who was both nurse and executioner, comforter and assassin. Where Aldrich's precise recognition of his wife's lethal intentions had been twisted into irrefutable proof of his supposed insanity, his nightmare deepened. He was being slowly executed by the very woman he was legally chained to, and every desperate attempt he made to shield himself or to seek assistance only became further evidence that he had lost his mind. Yet the cruelty did not stop there. The design of Philippe and Henri's vengeance was never limited to physical torment. It was carefully constructed to shatter him entirely. Their plan encompassed psychological annihilation, the severing of every tie, the extinguishing of every friendship, and the collapse of every fragile bond of respectability that Jeremiah Aldrich had once clung to. They wanted his ending to be lonely, stripped bare and merciless, his heart breaking with the belief that justice had at last cornered him, punishing him for the ruthless life he had built with such precision and brutality. That cruel truth unfolded with surgical malice during a dinner party Celeste arranged to mark the third month of their marriage. She gathered their dwindling circle of neighbors, Dr. Warren, and select figures of local influence who had maintained an uneasy cordiality with Willowbrook Plantation despite the scandalous nature of the union. Aldrich spent the day in paranoid preparation, consuming food in secret beforehand and steeling himself to reject whatever dishes his wife set before him. But when evening fell, Celeste unveiled her masterstroke, a ceremonial unveiling of a bottle of wine said to have rested untouched in the plantation cellar since before their vows were spoken. She presented it with the elegance of ritual, uncorking it publicly so no suspicion could be cast, and having it poured into polished glasses under the collective gaze of every guest. When Celeste raised her glass and offered a toast to their marriage and to countless years ahead, Aldrich's pulse thundered with dread. To refuse now before neighbors and acquaintances would brand him irredeemably insane. He lifted the glass, his eyes locked on hers across the flickering candlelight, and for a fleeting instant her mask slipped. Behind her veil of tenderness, he saw it, the glacial satisfaction of a predator savoring her triumph. By then, it was too late. The poisoned wine was at his lips, and Aldrich drank, silently praying that death would come swiftly rather than prolong his agony. The poison announced itself within minutes, his stomach wrenched with violent cramps, his breath caught as though fire scalded his lungs, his throat and chest aflame as if ignited from within. He fell forward onto the dining table, choking and clutching his abdomen, while horrified guests watched what they assumed was the inevitable collapse of a mind already consumed by madness. Dr. Warren lunged to render aid, yet even he was obstructed. Celeste threw herself upon her husband's writhing body, weeping hysterically, her cries pleading for his salvation while her ashing form ensured no true treatment could be given. Her act was flawless, so flawless that the guests, overcome with pity, turned to comfort the grieving wife rather than assist the dying man. As Aldrich lay gasping upon his own dining room floor, the life draining from him, Celeste bent low, her lips grazing his ear, and with that intimacy she unveiled the final revelation, her words sliced colder than the poison in his veins. Marcus Devo was my cousin, Jeremiah Samuel Rochelle, my uncle by marriage. Since 1845 I have worked with Philippe and Henri, biding my time, waiting for this night, for this hour, to see you die as they died, slowly, painfully, and utterly alone. In that final whisper, Aldrich understood the full horror. Celeste was no pawn. She was no instrument wielded by his enemies. She was one of them, blood of their blood, kin of their vengeance. His death was not merely plotted. It had been woven into the fabric of their family's retribution, a conspiracy perfected by time and sealed in blood. He had endured for months beneath the roof of a woman whose hatred was not borrowed, not purchased, not coerced, but raw, personal, and mercilessly immediate. Every plate she placed before him, every word spoken in the quiet chambers of that house, every illusion of ordinary domestic peace had been a cruelly staged performance, calibrated with precision to deepen his agony while erasing suspicion from those who watched his slow decline. As darkness crept across his vision and each breath scraped harder against his lungs, Aldrich could still hear Celeste continuing her masquerade for the audience she had so carefully assembled. She begged Dr. Warren to fight harder, implored heaven to spare her beloved husband, wept with the shattering grief of a woman whose world was collapsing in the shadow of impending loss. Around her, sympathetic neighbors murmured prayers, offering comfort, convinced beyond doubt that what they witnessed was a tragedy of nature rather than the carefully engineered climax of an 11-year revenge. Jeremiah Aldrich exhaled his final breath at precisely 9:47 p.m. on June 18, 1854, encircled by neighbors who believed they were watching a man succumb to stroke or heart failure brought on by madness and declining health. Dr. Warren signed the certificate with official detachment, declaring natural causes born of prolonged nervous exhaustion, a verdict that pacified everyone except Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle, who alone understood the true nature of the weapon and the justice it delivered. The funeral was crowded, Celeste cloaked in widow's black, performing grief so flawlessly that plantation mistresses pressed offers of aid upon her, promising to guide her hand at Willowbrook in her hour of mourning. None suspected that the woman crying at the graveside was secretly savoring the triumph of the most intricate murder ever woven into Louisiana's soil. Yet Aldrich's death was not the epilogue. Philippe and Henri had calculated for every possible aftermath, including the fate of land, fortune, and widow. By law, Celeste became heir to Willowbrook, inheriting not only its grounds and slaves, but also the heavy chains of its debts that, as the conspirators reminded her, belonged now to them as agents of the banks. Within weeks, pen met parchment, and Celeste surrendered the plantation to their hands in exchange for the erasure of liabilities. Soon after, she vanished from Louisiana, heading northward, it was said, with enough wealth to begin anew in some city where her past as slave and poisoner would be buried in silence. Official records, neat and unquestioned, listed a plantation owner's death by natural decline and a transfer of title, nothing unusual amid the mounting chaos of a nation stumbling towards civil war. To the state, Jeremiah Aldrich was a cautionary footnote, a respectable man undone by eccentric choices and finance. I'll ruin. But within certain circles of New Orleans and neighboring parishes, another telling survived in whispers, passed from generation to generation. That tale spoke of a vengeance so patient it spanned 11 years, a justice so exact that punishment mirrored crime in duration and torment. It was repeated as a lesson. Never betray your partners. For some families count kin who are clever enough, merciless enough to dedicate a decade to perfecting revenge. In this way, Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle achieved what courts dared not attempt, what judges could never decree. They executed a death sentence with elegance, erased all traces of their hand, and immortalized themselves in the hidden annals of antebellum retribution. Their achievement demanded not only relentless patience and calculated intelligence, but also considerable financial power, and, above all, an intimate grasp of how Louisiana's tangled social hierarchy and corrupt legal machinery truly operated. The metamorphosis of Willowbrook Plantation following Aldrich's death stood as undeniable proof of just how meticulously Philippe and Henry had designed their vengeance. Instead of liquidating the estate for immediate gain, they transformed it into a sanctuary for liberated men and women, and a haven for fugitives fleeing bondage, establishing precisely the kind of humanitarian outpost that would have tormented the spirit of the man who had amassed his fortune through chains and auctions. The grand plantation house that had once hosted banquets for Louisiana's aristocracy was remade into a hidden station on the Underground Railroad, guiding desperate souls toward freedom in the northern states and even into Canada. This reversal was not only symbolically devastating but also tactically concealed from prying eyes. Their respectable commercial ties shielded Willowbrook's unusual activities, while their polished reputation as honorable businessmen discouraged scrutiny from officials who might have wondered why the estate no longer functioned as it once had. In this way, they had weaponized their enemy's property, turning his proudest creation into a living strike against the system he had embodied. Yet the most extraordinary feature of their retribution was how utterly it erased Jeremiah Aldrich from collective memory. Unlike ordinary murder victims, who are at least acknowledged as casualties of violence, Aldrich was deliberately wiped away, expunged from existence itself. His wealth was carefully redirected into the hands of families ruined by his betrayals. His land was converted to purposes that mocked his values at every turn. His reputation collapsed under the weight of his own humiliating actions rather than through any later revelation of his hidden crimes. Most decisively, the very manner of his death had been orchestrated to ensure that he would be remembered, if at all, as nothing more than an eccentric planter who squandered his fortune and disgraced himself by marrying beneath his station. No monuments would rise in his name, no descendants would preserve his line, no record would preserve his deeds. He had been obliterated from Louisiana's annals as completely as if he had never walked the earth, and so this chilling tale demonstrates how true justice sometimes emerges beyond the reach of courts or legislatures, especially in societies where official institutions serve only to shield the privileged while crushing the powerless. What is your judgment on this tale? Do you believe every secret was truly uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story unsettled you and you crave more horrors hidden in history, subscribe, strike the notification bell, and pass it along to a friend who delights in dark mysteries. Until next time, we meet again in the shadows.